Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video will be part 4 of 5 of this farmhouse style dining table build. In today's video, I'll show you how I get this super glossy finish on top of the staining that I did on the tabletop. This is gloss polyurethane with espresso stain. So I'll show you how I did this and give you some of the tips that I use to get a good finish on this tabletop. All right, let's get into it. So in this video, you'll see me stain the tabletop and clear coat it with polyurethane. So I'll give you some of the tips and tricks that I use to get a good finish on the tabletop. You may have noticed that I put a couple pieces of wood down and then covered them up with a rag. The reason that I do that is because I actually stain the bottom of the tabletop first. So the bottom is facing down. I put some rags down so that it would be soft and it wouldn't tear the surface up. The reason that I stain the bottom, and you can see as I'm doing here, is to get a feel for how the stain is taking, what the color looks like, how dark it is, and how difficult the stain is to work with. I'm using espresso stain, which can be a little difficult to work with, so I'm actually staining about as sloppy as I can to see how well I can blend the stains together if I go opposite of the grain at any point. So once I'm done messing around with the bottom, I flip the tabletop over. I did change gloves for this, as you really want to avoid any finger or thumbprints on the top because they will show through if you get a smudge on there before you stain. So once you actually get into this staining, the two most important points I can stress are to start lightly with the stain and to also go all the way across the grain. So you always want to stain with the grain if at all possible. So you can see here that I'm going all the way across the tabletop in the direction that the grain goes. If you can avoid stopping and leaving any heavy marks, that's what you want to try to do, because any heavy spots, especially with a difficult stain like espresso to work with, those heavy spots right in the middle where you stop, those will show through. So one thing that I really need to do right now, and hopefully I do shortly, is to stain over this breadboard that's closest to the bottom of the screen. I've gotten the breadboard far away, but I need to go over the close breadboard very soon. Otherwise, those heavy spots will show through. So I realized that, and then I immediately moved to the breadboard, and then it was okay to go back to the middle and stain more of the main piece of the table. If you haven't noticed already, I'm wearing a white t-shirt, staining with a dark stain, and somehow, once again, I managed to not get any of the stain on my shirt. So I have another shirt that made through it another video, so no doubt a stain can disaster is on the near horizon for me. Now, different stains all have their different characteristics. Some are much easier to work with. Some I think you could just splash on the table and it would all even out perfectly. Espresso is not one of those stains, so I try to be careful and go, like I said, with the grain direction when I do that. You also want to work quickly if you can. You don't want to try to do it as fast as possible, but you do want to be timely in getting the stain on the tabletop. You don't want to let those edges set for a long time. So once you have the top finally stained and the surface is covered, I like to go back over it several times using the flattest part of my hand that I can to make sure I'm not leaving any hard edges. And if there are any knots or cracks, you can always push whatever you're staining with down onto the crack to kind of drip some of the stain out. If you do that, just make sure that you go back over it and wipe that spot very well. Otherwise, the heavy spot might show. So I'll typically do the top surface first and then move on to the edges, mainly because the cloth I'm using already has stain on it. Also, the top is already done, so when I'm overlapping the stain with that, I can just wipe that off. It won't leave an original hard line, and then I would have to go back and cover up the stain. So I make sure I have any of the cracks and textured surfaces on the sides covered very well, and then I'll go over the top and the side one last time just to wipe off any hard spots. Then the stain is done and it can be left to dry. So this is the polyurethane product that I used. It's Minwax Gloss, and this is applied about 3 days after I finished putting the wood stain on. The can on the wood stain says to let dry at least 4 hours. I think that's way too short personally. I like to let the stain dry as long as possible. If the stain isn't completely dry, sometimes the polyurethane will kind of pull the stain back out of the table, and it can leave the finish looking smudgy and kind of messy overall. So I like to first dump a little bit of polyurethane on the tabletop and then spread that around using the brush. I don't like to dip the brush back into the main can in case there's any color or discoloration within the brush. That way that the poly in the can still stays pure and untouched. So the main point that I want to emphasize on the first coat is just to get adequate coverage around the tabletop. I did 4 coats overall before I did the finishing coat with a wipe-on poly, so the polyurethane gets pretty thick. Here in this shot, you can see where the polyurethane isn't, and as I brush it onto that section, you can really see the shine come through. So that's one thing I like about using gloss poly on espresso, is that whenever you pour it on, it really does make the espresso pop and turn into a completely different look that looks great overall. So in between coats, I like to sand with 400 grit sandpaper. Now with 400 grit, you're really just sanding out any of the bubbles. You're not actually going to sand into the polyurethane coat. I'm using very little pressure though. That said, like I mentioned, I'm just trying to get the bubbles out. Don't forget to go over the corners and the edges too. And whenever you're sanding, go with the grain, as if you make any cuts into the polyurethane, you want those to be along with the grain to kind of hide that if that happens. As you sand over the polyurethane, you can almost gauge how much you need to continue sanding by how it sounds. Once you've gotten rid of all the bubbles, it really doesn't make any sound at all. So you probably can't hear it on the audio and the video, but whenever you go across this with 400, you can hear the bubbles being sanded out of that. So before you put the next coat of poly on, I like to wipe off all of the dust. You can use basically whatever kind of towel or rag you want. Just make sure that it doesn't shed whatever the material is, because you don't want that to be embedded within the next coat of poly. Once everything is sanded down smooth, you can just dump the next layer of polyurethane right on top. There's really not a whole lot of difference in the first coat and the second coat, but when you're putting on an additional coat, it will be harder to see since you have a glossy base coat on already. So I'll normally wait about 24 hours to let the top coat dry before I sand it down in preparation for the next coat. If you try to sand it before that, sometimes the poly will still be wet and it'll kind of gum up in the sandpaper. Finally, I'll brush all the way across the table from side to side to make sure I don't have any pools of polyurethane in the middle. So after I have my base coats on, in this case I used 4 coats on the base coat, I like to use this wipe-on polyurethane, and this really allows me to get a super smooth and super glassy finish on the top. So unlike brushing the other polyurethane on like a heavy top coat, this almost acts more like wiping something off of a finished tabletop, like if you spilled water on top and you're trying to clean that off. So it's a very thin coat, but it will cover the top very, very smooth. It'll fill in any of the bubbles that were sanded out and leaves a super smooth finish on top. So be sure to look over the top to make sure you don't have any heavy poly spots left, and then don't forget about those side edges as well. So I really love this polyurethane product, and you've seen me use this in a lot of my previous videos. Not only does this leave a crazy super high glossy finish, but it'll also protect the stain, the wood, and the color of everything all together. The most important tips that I can give you when using polyurethane is to make sure to spread the polyurethane out throughout the tabletop. You don't want any heavy pools or any large puddles of polyurethane left as the tabletop dries. Also, don't be afraid to sand the polyurethane in between coats. I avoided doing this for a long time, but once I finally sanded everything down, it really helped the finish turn out even better. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found these tips useful. If you have any tips that I didn't cover, be sure to leave those in the comments, as I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you tune in next week for the last video of this farmhouse table build, where I'll show you how to attach the top. As always, thanks for watching and stay tuned for more.